Chapter 1. The Decluttered Life. Chris Thompson stood in the middle of his living room, holding a single strand of white Christmas lights like it was a foreign object. The apartment smelled faintly of pine from the artificial tree he dragged out of storage. A modest 6-footer that looked like it belonged in a dentist's waiting room. He stared at it, then at the lights, then back at the tree. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "People do this for fun?" The tree didn't answer. It just stood there, judgmental and bare, like it knew he'd rather be anywhere else. 2 years ago, he would have been knee-deep in garland and glitter, Vicky humming carols in the background, Emma laughing as she tried to hang ornaments too high for her reach. Back then, Christmas was a family production. Now it was him, alone, with a tree that looked like it had given up on life. Chris sighed and plugged in the lights. They flickered weakly, like they were trying but not quite committed. He draped them over the branches with the enthusiasm of a man folding laundry. When he stepped back, the effect was fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine, which honestly described his entire approach to the holiday season. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Emma's name lit up the screen. "Hey kiddo," he said, answering. "Dad." Emma's voice was bright, like Christmas morning in human form. "Please tell me you're not sitting in the dark eating cereal again." Chris smirked. "Nope, upgraded to decorating a tree. Very festive over here." "Really?" Suspicion dripped from her tone. "What kind of tree?" "A green one," he deadpanned. "Dad." "Artificial. 6 feet. Looks respectable." Emma laughed. "Respectable? That's not a Christmas vibe. That's a tax audit." Chris chuckled. "Well, I'm going for minimalist this year." "Minimalist? You mean lazy." "Efficient," he corrected. "I decluttered, remember? No more boxes of ornaments from 2003. No more inflatable reindeer that scare the neighbors. Just me, a tree, and a strand of lights." There was a pause, then a softer tone. "You sound happy." Chris leaned against the wall, looking at his half-hearted tree. "I am," he said honestly. "It's quiet. Simple. No drama." Emma didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was careful. "Mom said you're doing good." Chris kept his tone neutral. "I am." Another pause. "She's fine too." He didn't ask. He never asked. That was the rule he'd made for himself the day Vicky said she wanted out. No bitterness. No gossip. No digging for details. She was Emma's mother, and that meant respect, even if it didn't mean attention. "That's good," he said simply. Emma exhaled, like she'd been holding something in. "Anyway, I just wanted to check in." "Oh, are you coming to the tree lighting ceremony tomorrow?" Chris groaned. "The one downtown? With the carolers and the hot cocoa and the crowd of people pretending they like each other?" "Yes, that one," Emma said cheerfully. "You should go." "Why?" "Because it's Christmas, Dad. And because you need to get out of your apartment before you start talking to the tree." Chris eyed the tree. "Too late." Emma laughed. "Seriously, go. It'll be fun." "Fun for who?" "For you. Maybe you'll meet someone." Chris snorted. "Not happening." "Why not?" "Because I'm not interested," he said firmly. "This is my time, Em. 18 years of marriage, 18 years of putting myself last. I'm good. I like my life the way it is." Emma was quiet for a beat. "Okay," she said finally. "But promise me you'll at least think about it?" Chris hesitated. "I'll think about it." "Good enough," she said, satisfied. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, kiddo." He hung up and stared at the tree again. It looked slightly better now that the lights were on, but it still felt hollow, like a placeholder for something bigger. He shook off the thought. He didn't need bigger. He didn't need anything. For the first time in his adult life, he was responsible for no one but himself. And he liked it that way. Later that night, Chris sat on his couch with a glass of bourbon, scrolling through his phone. His social feed was a parade of holiday cheer, families in matching pajamas, couples kissing under mistletoe, friends clinking glasses at parties. He scrolled past all of it without a flicker of envy. He'd had that life. He'd done the family thing. And when Vicky said she wanted out, he didn't fight. Not because he didn't care, but because he'd seen it coming. The distance, the size, the way she stopped laughing at his jokes. He wasn't surprised when she said she wasn't happy anymore. He was surprised she lasted as long as she did. He took another sip of bourbon and let the warmth settle in his chest. 2 years of freedom. 2 years of decluttering, not just his apartment but his mind. He'd sold, trashed, or gifted 18 years of accumulated stuff. No more boxes of memories gathering dust. No more furniture he hated but kept because Vicky liked it. His life was clean, simple, stress-free, and he intended to keep it that way. The next morning, Chris woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds. He made coffee, toasted a bagel, and sat at the kitchen counter scrolling through emails. One subject line caught his eye. "Maplewood Christmas Market opens today." He almost deleted it. Then he remembered Emma's voice. "You need to get out of your apartment before you start talking to the tree." Chris sighed. Maybe he'd swing by the market. Not for the socializing, God forbid, but for the practical stuff. He needed a gift for Emma. Something thoughtful. Something that said, I know you better than anyone, because he did. She was 16, smart, funny, and way too perceptive for his comfort. She deserved more than a gift card. He grabbed his coat, locked the door, and stepped into the crisp December air. Snow dusted the sidewalks, and the town looked like a postcard. Twinkling lights strung across lampposts, wreaths on every door, the scent of cinnamon drifting from the bakery on the corner. Chris shoved his hands in his pockets and walked toward the market, telling himself this was just a quick errand. No mingling, no carolers, no mistletoe, just a gift. Chapter 2. The Christmas Market Collision. Chris Thompson hated crowds. He hated the way people shuffled like penguins, clutching paper cups of overpriced cocoa, pretending they were thrilled to be freezing their faces off in the name of holiday cheer. He hated the carolers who sang like they were auditioning for Broadway. Mostly, he hated that he was here, at the Maplewood Christmas market, because his daughter had guilt-tripped him into getting out. He tugged his coat tighter and scanned the rows of booths. Handmade ornaments, scented candles, scarves that looked like they'd been knitted by elves on a sugar high. He just needed one thing, a gift for Emma. Something that said, I'm still the best dad in the world, even if her mother was trying to win that title back with spa days and shopping sprees. Chris stopped at a booth selling artisanal mugs. Each one had a quirky phrase painted in looping script. Slay all day, resting Grinch face, Santa's favorite. He picked up one that said jingle juice and smirked. Emma would roll her eyes so hard they'd practically leave orbit. Careful, a voice said behind him. That one's a bestseller. You break it, you buy it. Chris turned and promptly knocked his elbow into a display of cocoa samples. The tiny paper cups wobbled like dominoes and then tipped, spilling a cascade of chocolatey liquid across the counter and onto the scarf of the woman standing there. Oh, hell, Chris muttered, grabbing napkins. I'm so sorry. The woman looked down at her scarf, then up at him. Her eyes were green, bright, amused, and not even remotely angry. Well, she said, dabbing at the mess. That's one way to make an introduction. Chris handed her a fistful of napkins. Seriously, I didn't mean... Relax, she said, smiling. It's cocoa, not acid. And this scarf has seen worse. Chris blinked. Worse than a cocoa tsunami? Pumpkin spice latte, she said gravely. October was brutal. He laughed despite himself. I'll buy you a new scarf. She waved him off. Don't worry about it. I own the booth next door. I've got backups. Chris glanced at the sign above her booth. Holly's Holiday Haven. Rows of ornaments glittered under twinkling lights, each one hand-painted with intricate designs. Snowflakes, reindeer, tiny Christmas villages. The woman, Holly, apparently was about his age, maybe a few years younger. Her hair was chestnut brown, tucked into a messy bun that somehow looked intentional. She wore a red sweater that screamed festive without being tacky. You run this? He asked, gesturing to the display. Guilty, she said. Seasonal pop-up. Keeps me busy and caffeinated. Chris nodded, still feeling like an idiot for the cocoa incident. Well, nice to meet you, Holly. I'm Chris. Nice to meet you, Chris, she said, her smile widening. And thanks for the free scarf wash. He chuckled. Glad I could help. She tilted her head, studying him. You don't look like a market guy. Chris raised an eyebrow. What's a market guy? Someone who wears a Santa hat unironically and says things like, "Efalalala fabulous." Chris smirked. Yeah, that's not me. I figured, she said. You've got the vibe of someone who came here under duress. Pretty much, he admitted. My daughter insisted. Ah, Holly said knowingly. Teenager. 16, Chris said. Smart, funny, and way too invested in my social life. Holly laughed. Sounds like a good kid. She is, Chris said, and for a moment his chest warmed. Not from the cocoa spill, but from the thought of Emma. I'm just here to find her a gift and escape before someone tries to make me sing carols. Holly grinned. Well, you're in luck. I've got ornaments that can be personalized. Names, dates, inside jokes. Guaranteed to earn you best dad points. Chris hesitated. Inside jokes. Sure, she said, pulling out a blank ornament. You tell me something that makes her laugh. I'll paint it. Chris thought for a moment. She calls me Captain Declutter. Holly laughed so hard she nearly dropped the ornament. That's fantastic. Long story, Chris said, smiling despite himself. But yeah, that's her thing. Then that's what we'll do, Holly said, grabbing a brush. One Captain Declutter ornament coming right up. Chris watched as she worked, her hands steady, her expression focused but playful. She hummed softly, Jingle Bell Rock, but off-key enough to be charming. He found himself relaxing, the tension in his shoulders easing as the market buzzed around them. So, Holly said, glancing up, are you a Maplewood local? Born and raised, Chris said. Left for college, came back, stayed. Same, she said. Though I did a 5-year stint in Chicago before realizing I hate traffic and love small-town Christmas. Chris chuckled. Chicago's great, if you like honking. Exactly, she said, smiling. Here, people honk to say hi. There, they honk to say move or die. Chris laughed, and it felt good, easy, unforced. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that with someone who wasn't Emma. Holly finished the ornament and held it up. In elegant script, it read, Captain Declutter, Christmas 2025. Tiny snowflakes framed the words, and a little broom swept across the bottom like a badge of honor. Chris grinned. That's perfect. Glad you like it, Holly said, wrapping it in tissue paper. Consider it my apology for the cocoa ambush. Pretty sure that was my fault, Chris said. Details, she said, waving a hand. Let's call it a joint effort. Chris handed her cash, and as she gave him the bag, their fingers brushed, just for a second. It was nothing. A flicker. A spark he ignored. Thanks, he said, stepping back. Emma's gonna love this. She sounds awesome, Holly said. Bring her by sometime. I'll give her the VIP ornament tour. Chris smiled. I'll tell her. He turned to leave, but Holly called after him. Hey, Chris. He looked back. Yeah. Don't skip the tree lighting tonight, she said, her eyes twinkling. It's the best part of the season. Chris smirked. We'll see. Holly grinned. Translation. You'll be there. Chris shook his head, amused, and walked away, the ornament bag swinging at his side. He told himself he wasn't going to the tree lighting. He told himself he didn't care about Holly's smile or the way her laugh had felt like something. He told himself this was just a quick errand, nothing more. But as he stepped into the crisp December air, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't entirely sure he believed himself. Chapter 3. Daughter's plot. Chris Thompson had just set the ornament Holly made, Captain Declutter in elegant script, on his kitchen counter when his phone buzzed again. Emma. He grinned, already bracing for her interrogation. Hey, kiddo, he said, answering. Did you go? Emma asked without preamble. Chris smirked. Define go. The market, Dad. Did you go? I did, he said, leaning against the counter. Mission accomplished. Got you something. Emma gasped theatrically. What is it? Not telling, Chris said. You'll see on Christmas. Ugh, you're the worst, she groaned, then softened. Okay, fine. But did you talk to anyone? Chris frowned. What kind of question is that? The kind where I'm hoping you didn't just buy a gift and run like a ninja. Chris chuckled. I talked to the vendor. Vendor? Emma's voice perked up. Guy or girl? Chris hesitated. Woman. Emma squealed so loudly Chris had to pull the phone away. Dad. Details. There are no details, Chris said firmly. She runs an ornament booth. She made you something custom. End of story. Emma was practically vibrating through the phone. What's her name? Chris sighed. Holly. Oh my God. That's so Christmas. Why? Emma said. Please tell me she was wearing a Santa hat. No hat, Chris said. Red sweater. Emma gasped again. Dad. That's festive. That's practically a sign from the universe. Chris rolled his eyes. Emma. Don't Emma me, she said. This is fate. Holly and Christmas? It's like a Hallmark movie waiting to happen. Chris laughed. Yeah, well, I'm not auditioning. You should, Emma said. Seriously, Dad. You deserve someone fun. Someone who makes you laugh. Chris's smile faded a little. I'm fine, Em. Really. I know, she said softly. But you've been alone for 2 years. Don't you miss having someone? Chris thought about that. About the quiet nights, the bourbon, the freedom. About the laughter he'd shared with Holly, brief, unexpected, easy. He pushed the thought away. I'm good, he said. Promise. Emma sighed, clearly unconvinced. Okay, but you're going to the tree lighting tonight, right? Chris groaned. Emma. Dad, she said, her voice dropping into that tone. The one that meant she wasn't asking, she was commanding. Go, please. For me. Chris rubbed his forehead. Fine. Yes. Emma cheered. You won't regret it. Chris muttered something about regretting everything and hung up. He stared at the ornament again, then at the clock. The tree lighting was in 3 hours. He could stay home. He could pour another bourbon and binge old movies. He could ignore the way Holly's laugh had stuck in his head like a song he didn't ask for. Or he could go. Across town, Vicky Thompson sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine. Emma's voice floated from the living room, bright and animated as she FaceTimed a friend. Dad met someone, Emma said, her tone conspiratorial. Vicky froze. What? The friend asked. At the market, Emma said. Her name's Holly. She makes ornaments. He bought me one. Vicky's stomach twisted. Holly. Of course her name was Holly. Festive. Cute. Probably the kind of woman who baked cookies and wore scarves without spilling cocoa on them. Vicky took a slow sip of wine, trying to steady herself. She told herself she was fine, that she didn't care what Chris did, that she was happy, free, living her best life. But the truth was ugly and sharp. She hated that he was happy without her. Hated that he hadn't begged, hadn't fought, hadn't even flinched when she said she wanted out. She thought he'd chase her. She thought he'd make grand gestures, promise to change, cry if he had to. Instead, he'd nodded like he'd been expecting it. like he'd been waiting for her to say the words. And now he was smiling at some woman named Holly. Vicky set down her glass and stared at the twinkling lights on her own tree. They looked hollow, like everything else. That evening, Chris stood at the edge of Maplewood Square, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. The tree towered in the center, strung with thousands of lights that glowed against the dark sky. People milled around, sipping cocoa, laughing, singing along with carolers. Chris scanned the crowd, telling himself he wasn't looking for anyone in particular. Then he saw her. Holly stood near her booth, chatting with a customer, her red sweater bright against the snow-dusted backdrop. She laughed at something, and Chris felt that flicker again, the one he'd been ignoring since the market. He could leave. He could turn around, go home, and forget this whole thing. Instead, he walked toward her. "Back for round two?" Holly said when she spotted him, her eyes sparkling. Chris smirked. "Just here for the lights." "Sure," she said, grinning. "Not for the ornaments?" "Already got the best one," he said, holding up the bag. Holly laughed. "Captain Declutter rides again." Chris chuckled. "Emma's gonna love it." "I bet she will," Holly said. "So, what do you think? Pretty magical, right?" Chris glanced at the tree, the lights, the crowd. "It's festive." Holly laughed. "That's the most lukewarm review I've ever heard." Chris shrugged. "I'm not really a Christmas guy." "Everyone's a Christmas guy," Holly said. "Some people just need convincing." Chris raised an eyebrow. "You volunteering?" "Maybe," she said, her smile playful. "Depends. Are you a lost cause?" Chris hesitated, then smiled. "Probably." Holly grinned. "Challenge accepted." Before he could respond, the mayor stepped up to the microphone, announcing the countdown. The crowd cheered, voices rising in unison. 10, 9, 8. Chris found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with Holly, the warmth of her presence cutting through the winter chill. 3, fun. The tree burst into light, thousands of bulbs twinkling like stars. The crowd erupted in applause. Holly clapped, her face glowing in the golden shimmer. Chris looked at her, and for a moment he forgot everything. The divorce, the solitude, the rules he'd made for himself. All he saw was her smile, bright and unguarded, and the way it made something deep inside him stir. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know what to do with it. But he knew one thing. For the first time in a long time, Christmas didn't feel hollow. Chapter 4. Unexpected invite. Chris Thompson had a plan for the evening. Go home, pour a bourbon, and congratulate himself for surviving the tree lighting without singing jingle bells in public. He'd even managed to avoid cocoa disasters this time. A win by his standards. But fate or Holly Bennett had other ideas. He was halfway across Maplewood Square when he heard her voice behind him. "Chris, wait up." He turned, and there she was, weaving through the crowd with the kind of energy that made people instinctively smile. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her messy buns slightly looser than before, and she was carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. Chris raised an eyebrow. "You look official." Holly grinned. "That's because I am. Sort of." "Should I be worried?" "Only if you hate charity," she said, falling into step beside him. "Which, judging by your minimalist vibe, I'm guessing you don't." Chris smirked. "Minimalist doesn't mean heartless." "Good," Holly said, thrusting the clipboard toward him. "Because I need volunteers." Chris stared at it like it was a ticking bomb. "For what?" "The Maplewood Holiday Fundraiser," Holly said, her voice bright and persuasive. "We're raising money for the community center. Tomorrow night, it's going to be amazing silent auction, raffle, live music, cookies shaped like reindeer. All the festive chaos you can handle." Chris blinked. "And you want me to?" "Help," Holly said simply. "We're short-staffed. I saw you at the tree lighting, looking all capable." Chris laughed. "Capable? I spilled cocoa on you yesterday." "True," Holly said, her eyes twinkling. "But you handled it with grace. That's a rare skill." Chris shook his head. "Holly, I'm not really a volunteer guy." "Everyone's a volunteer guy," she said, echoing her Christmas logic from earlier. "Some people just need convincing." Chris smirked. "You're relentless." "Thank you," Holly said, like it was a compliment. "Come on, it'll be fun. You'll meet people, eat cookies, maybe even bid on something ridiculous like a basket of artisanal jams." Chris hesitated. He could say no. He could walk away, go home, and stick to his plan. But Holly was looking at him with that smile, the one that made him feel like saying no would be a crime against humanity. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll help." Holly beamed. "Yes, you won't regret it." Chris muttered something about regretting everything and signed the clipboard. Holly handed him a flyer with details and tapped the paper like it was a secret map. 7 o'clock. Community center. Wear something festive. Chris groaned. "Define festive." "Not black," Holly said, eyeing his coat. "And maybe a tie with snowflakes?" Chris laughed. "You're dreaming." "Challenge accepted," Holly said, her grin wicked. "See you tomorrow, Captain Declutter." Chris shook his head, amused and slightly unsettled by how easily she'd roped him in. He told himself it was just one night, just helping out. Nothing more. But as he walked away, he realized something he didn't want to admit. He was looking forward to it. Across town, Vicky Thompson sat on her couch, scrolling through social media with a glass of wine. Emma was upstairs, humming Christmas songs while wrapping gifts. Vicky's feed was a parade of holiday cheer. Families posing in front of trees, couples kissing under mistletoe, friends clinking glasses at parties. Then she saw it, a photo from the tree lighting. Holly Bennett, smiling in her red sweater, standing next to her ornament booth. The caption read, "Support local artisans at the Maplewood Christmas Market." Vicky stared at the photo, her stomach twisting. Holly was pretty, not movie star glamorous, but warm, approachable, the kind of woman who made people feel at ease. The kind of woman Chris might laugh with. The thought hit like a punch. She told herself she was fine, that she didn't care what Chris did, that she was happy, free, living her best life. But the truth was ugly and sharp. She hated that he was happy without her. Hated that he hadn't begged, hadn't fought, hadn't even flinched when she said she wanted out. She thought he'd chase her. She thought he'd make grand gestures, promise to change, cry if he had to. Instead, he'd nodded like he'd been expecting it, like he'd been waiting for her to say the words. And now he was smiling at some woman named Holly. Vicky set down her glass and stared at the twinkling lights on her own tree. They looked hollow, like everything else. The next evening, Chris stood in front of his closet, glaring at his options. Holly had said festive, which apparently meant not black. His wardrobe was a sea of gray, navy, and charcoal. He finally settled on a dark green sweater, technically festive if you squinted, and jeans that didn't look like they'd been through a war. When he arrived at the community center, the place was buzzing. Strings of lights crisscrossed the ceiling, tables overflowed with raffle prizes, and the scent of cinnamon and sugar hung in the air. People laughed, music played, and Chris wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. Then he saw Holly. She was at the registration table, wearing a deep red dress that managed to be both simple and stunning. Her hair was down now, curling softly around her shoulders. She looked up, spotted him, and smiled. A smile that hit him like sunlight after a storm. "Captain Declutter," she called, waving him over. Chris walked to the table, trying not to feel like a teenager with a crush. "Reporting for duty." "Perfect," Holly said, handing him a name tag. "You're on raffle ticket duty. Sell as many as you can. Use your charm." Chris smirked. "What charm?" Holly grinned. "The one you hide under all that sarcasm." Chris laughed, and for the next hour he worked the crowd, selling tickets, cracking jokes, and, much to his surprise, actually enjoying himself. People were friendly, the music was good, and the cookies were dangerously addictive. Every so often, he'd catch Holly's eye across the room, and she'd flash him a smile that made his chest feel weirdly light. By the time the raffle ended, Chris had sold more tickets than anyone else. Holly announced it over the microphone, calling him Maplewood's MVP, and the crowd cheered. Chris felt his face heat, but he couldn't stop smiling. After the event wound down, Holly found him near the refreshment table, holding 2 cups of cocoa. "Peace offering," she said, handing him one. "Promise I won't spill." Chris chuckled. "Thanks." They clinked cups like champagne glasses, and for a moment it felt easy, natural, like this was something they'd done 100 times before. "You were amazing tonight," Holly said. "Seriously. Thank you." Chris shrugged. "It was fun." Holly smiled. "See? Told you you're not a lost cause." Chris laughed, and before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "How's the party? Did you talk to Holly?" Chris shook his head, amused. Holly noticed and raised an eyebrow. "Emma?" "Yeah," Chris said. "She's invested." Holly grinned. "Smart kid." Chris smiled, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Chapter 5. The charity chaos. Chris Thompson had one goal for the night: survive the Maplewood holiday fundraiser without becoming a meme. After last night's unexpected success selling raffle tickets, Holly had texted him, "You're officially on the decorating crew. See you at 6. We're something you can climb a ladder in." Chris had stared at the message for a full minute before replying. Define climb. Now, standing in the community center with a coil of Christmas lights around his neck like a boa constrictor, he regretted every life choice that had led him here. "Captain Declutter." Holly's voice rang out like a carol. She strode toward him, clipboard in hand, wearing jeans and a green sweater that somehow made her look like she'd stepped out of a holiday magazine. Her hair was in that same messy bun, strands framing her face in a way that felt unfair. Chris raised an eyebrow. "You're enjoying this way too much." "Absolutely," Holly said, grinning. "Now your mission, should you choose to accept, is to help me hang these lights without electrocuting anyone." Chris looked at the tangled mess in his hands. "Pretty sure this is a violation of the Geneva Convention." Holly laughed. "You'll be fine. Just follow my lead." The decorating started smoothly enough, if you ignored Chris muttering under his breath about knots that defied physics. Holly was on a ladder, reaching for the top of a garland arch, while Chris fed her strands of lights like a reluctant elf. "Little more slack," Holly called down. Chris tugged. The lights jerked, and Holly wobbled. "Whoa!" she yelped, grabbing the ladder. Chris lunged instinctively, steadying the base. "You okay?" Holly laughed breathlessly. "Yep, just testing your reflexes." Chris smirked. "You're welcome." "Good save," she said, flashing him a grin that made his chest feel weirdly light. "You'd make a decent elf." Chris snorted. "Not a chance." "Fine," Holly said, pretending to pout. "Grinch it is." Chris chuckled, and for the next hour, they worked side by side, stringing lights, hanging wreaths, and debating the merits of tinsel. Holly argued it was festive. Chris claimed it was glitter's evil cousin. She teased him about his minimalist tendencies, calling him Captain Declutter every chance she got. He pretended to hate it, but secretly, he liked the way her voice wrapped around the nickname like it belonged to him. By the time the event started, the community center looked like a Christmas card. Twinkling lights, garlands draped across tables, and a towering tree in the corner. Chris surveyed their handiwork with reluctant pride. "Not bad," he admitted. "Not bad." Holly gasped. "This is spectacular." Chris smirked. "Spectacular might be a stretch." Holly grinned. "You're impossible." "Efficient," Chris corrected. "Stubborn," Holly countered. Chris laughed, and before he could respond, the music kicked in, a jazzy version of Let It Snow. Couples drifted onto the dance floor, swaying under the lights. Chris reached for a cookie, planning to stay firmly on the sidelines. "Dance with me," Holly said suddenly. Chris froze mid-bite. "What? Dance?" Holly repeated, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Come on, it's Christmas." Chris shook his head. "Nope. Why not?" "Because I don't dance," Chris said firmly. "Ever." Holly tilted her head. "Ever. Ever," Chris said. "Last time I danced, Emma was in diapers." Holly laughed. "Then you're overdue." Chris opened his mouth to argue, but Holly grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the floor with surprising strength for someone who painted ornaments for a living. "Holly, relax," she said, smiling up at him. "It's just one song." Chris sighed, resigned, and let her lead him into the crowd. The music swelled, and suddenly, he was standing under twinkling lights with Holly's hand in his, her other hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She smelled like cinnamon and something warm he couldn't name. "See," Holly said softly. "Not so bad." Chris swallowed. "Debatable." Holly laughed, and the sound wrapped around him like a ribbon. They moved slowly, awkwardly at first, then easier as the song flowed. Chris wasn't graceful. He knew that, but Holly didn't seem to care. She smiled, teased, and every so often, her fingers brushed his in a way that made his pulse trip. For a moment, Chris forgot everything. The divorce, the rules he'd made for himself, the quiet life he'd sworn to protect. All he saw was Holly, her eyes bright, her laugh soft, and the way she fit against him like this was where she belonged. The song ended, and Chris stepped back, clearing his throat. "Well, that was something." Holly grinned. "You survived." "Barely," Chris said, reaching for another cookie to cover the fact that his heart was doing weird things. Before Holly could reply, a voice cut through the music. "Chris." He turned and froze. "Vicky." She stood near the entrance, wearing a sleek black coat and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. For a second, Chris felt like the floor had tilted. He hadn't seen her in weeks, not since Emma's birthday, and now she was here, looking like a ghost from a life he'd packed away. "Vicky," Chris said, his voice even. "Hi," she said, her gaze flicking to Holly, then back to him. "Emma told me about the fundraiser. I thought I'd stop by." Chris nodded. "It's for a good cause." "Looks beautiful," Vicky said, her tone tight. "You did all this?" "Team effort," Chris said, glancing at Holly, who smiled politely. Vicky's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Well, I just wanted to say hi." "Hi," Chris said again, because what else was there? Vicky hesitated, then turned to leave, her heels clicking against the floor. Chris watched her go, a strange mix of relief and something heavier settling in his chest. Holly touched his arm lightly. "You okay?" Chris nodded. "Yeah, just unexpected." Holly smiled gently. "Life's full of surprises." Chris looked at her, and for the first time he wondered if that was a good thing. Later, as Chris walked to his car, the night air crisp and sharp, he replayed the evening in his head. The laughter, the lights, the dance, and Vicky's sudden appearance. He didn't know what she wanted. He didn't know why it mattered. But he knew one thing. When Holly had smiled at him under those twinkling lights, it had felt like Christmas wasn't just a season. It was a beginning. Chapter 6. Vicky's Confession. Chris Thompson was halfway through his second cup of coffee when the knock came. It was soft, hesitant, the kind of knock that didn't belong to a delivery guy or a neighbor asking for sugar. Chris frowned, set down his mug, and opened the door. Vicky stood there. For a moment, Chris just stared. She looked different. Not dramatically. Still the same chestnut hair, still the same sharp cheekbones, but there was something in her eyes, something tired, something that made Chris's stomach tighten. "Hi," Vicky said, her voice careful. "Hey." Chris said, keeping his tone neutral. Everything okay? She nodded, then hesitated. Can I come in? Chris stepped aside. Sure. Vicky walked in, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. She glanced around the apartment, her gaze sweeping over the minimalist space, the clean lines, the absence of clutter, the quiet simplicity that had become Chris's sanctuary. You've changed things, she said finally. Chris shrugged. Needed a fresh start. Vicky smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. It looks nice. Chris waited. He knew this wasn't about interior design. Vicky turned to him, her hands twisting together. I saw you at the fundraiser. Chris nodded. Yeah, Holly roped me in. Vicky's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She seems nice. Chris didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to. Vicky took a breath, like she was bracing for impact. Chris, I need to say something. Chris leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Okay. I made a mistake, Vicky said, her voice breaking on the last word. The biggest mistake of my life. Chris felt the words land like stones, heavy and sharp. He didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. I thought I was unhappy, Vicky continued, her eyes shining. I thought I needed excitement, something new. I thought if I left, life would just fall into place. But it didn't. It's lonely, Chris. It's empty. And every time Emma tells me about something fun you're doing, it's like, her voice cracked. It's like I threw away everything that mattered. Chris swallowed hard, his chest tight. He'd imagined this moment once, back when the divorce papers were fresh and his nights were long and silent. He'd wondered if she'd regret it, if she'd come back, if he'd want her to. Now, standing here, he knew the answer. I'm sorry, Vicky whispered. I thought you'd fight for me, for us, but you didn't. And that hurt, Chris. It hurt so much. But now I realize you were right. You were always right. You gave me everything, and I was too blind to see it. Chris exhaled slowly, his voice steady when he finally spoke. Vicky, I'm glad you told me that. I really am. But, she flinched at the word. But I can't go back, Chris said gently. Not because I'm angry, not because I don't care, but because that chapter's closed. For me. Vicky's eyes filled, and for a second, Chris saw the woman he'd loved for 18 years, the woman who'd laughed with him in kitchens, danced with him in living rooms, held his hand through storms. He felt the echo of that life, sharp and bittersweet. I'm sorry, he said softly. Vicky nodded, blinking hard. I know. I just needed to say it. Chris reached out, touched her arm lightly. You'll be okay. She gave a shaky laugh. Will I? Yes, Chris said, and he meant it. You're strong. You'll figure it out. Vicky nodded again, then turned toward the door. She paused, her hand on the knob. She's pretty, she said quietly. Holly. Chris didn't answer. He didn't need to. When the door closed behind her, Chris stood in the silence, his heart heavy and strange. He felt no triumph, no vindication, just a quiet sadness for what had been, and a flicker of something else. Hope. Because as much as Vicky's words had stirred old ghosts, they hadn't shaken the truth. Chris wasn't looking back. He was looking forward. And lately, forward had a name. Holly. Later that night, Chris sat on his couch, staring at the ornament Holly had made. Captain Declutter in looping script. He thought about her laugh, her smile, the way she'd pulled him onto the dance floor like it was the most natural thing in the world. He thought about the way his chest had felt lighter around her, like he'd been carrying something for years and finally set it down. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know where it would go. But he knew one thing. He wanted to find out. Chapter 7. Snowstorm and Serendipity. Chris Thompson had checked the weather that morning. Light flurries. Nothing major. Maplewood winters were predictable. Snow that looked pretty on postcards but rarely caused chaos. So when he agreed to swing by Holly's pop-up shop after work to pick up a second ornament Emma requested, because apparently one Captain Declutter wasn't enough, he didn't think twice. Until the sky turned white. By the time Chris parked outside Holly's shop, snow was falling in thick, relentless sheets, swirling like someone had shaken a snow globe too hard. He jogged to the door, boots crunching, and pushed inside, stamping the cold from his feet. Holly looked up from behind the counter, her cheeks flushed, her hair escaping its bun in soft curls. She wore a chunky cream sweater that looked like it had been knitted by angels. When she smiled, Chris forgot about the storm for a second. Captain Declutter, she said, grinning. Braving the blizzard for ornaments? Chris smirked, brushing snow from his coat. Emma insisted. Smart kid, Holly said, pulling out a box. I've got 2 ready, one for her best friend. Apparently, personalized ornaments are the new currency of cool. Chris chuckled. Good to know. He handed her cash, and as she wrapped the ornaments, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Chris glanced at the door, frowning. The snow was coming down harder now, thick enough to blur the streetlights. Looks bad, Holly said, following his gaze. They're saying it's the worst storm in 5 years. Chris raised an eyebrow. 5 years? That's comforting. Holly laughed softly. You might want to wait it out. Chris hesitated. He could try to drive home, but the roads were already slick, and the thought of skidding into a ditch didn't exactly scream holiday cheer. "Guess I'm stuck," he said finally. Holly smiled. "Guess you are." The shop was warm and cozy, lit by strings of fairy lights that cast a golden glow over shelves of ornaments. The scent of cinnamon drifted from a candle on the counter. Holly moved around, tidying displays, humming under her breath. Chris sat on a stool near the window, watching snow pile against the glass like a barricade. "Want cocoa?" Holly asked, holding up a tin. Chris smirked. "As long as it doesn't end up on your scarf." Holly laughed. "Deal." She busied herself with mugs and a kettle, and Chris found himself studying her. How easily she moved, how her laugh seemed to fill the space like music. He wasn't used to this. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was easy, comfortable, like they'd known each other longer than a handful of days. Holly handed him a steaming mug. "Peace offering." Chris took it, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thanks." They sipped in silence for a moment, watching snow swirl outside like a curtain. Then Holly spoke, her voice soft. "So, divorced?" Chris blinked, surprised by the bluntness. "Yeah, 2 years." Holly nodded. "Me too. 3 years." Chris studied her. "Kids?" "No," Holly said, her smile tinged with something wistful. "Just me and a cat who thinks he owns the place." Chris chuckled. "Sounds about right." Holly tilted her head. "Was it hard?" Chris thought about that. The nights alone, the quiet that felt like freedom and loss all tangled together. "Yeah," he said honestly. "At first. But it was the right thing." Holly nodded slowly. "Same." For a moment, they sat in the glow of fairy lights, two people who'd walked through storms. Different storms, but storms all the same. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and silent, like the world had pressed pause. An hour passed. Then 2. The storm showed no mercy. Chris helped Holly close up the shop, stacking boxes, unplugging lights, until the place looked like a cozy fortress against the white chaos outside. "Roads are a mess," Holly said, peering out the window. "You're not going anywhere." Chris smirked. "Guess I'm your hostage." Holly grinned. "Worst hostage situation ever. All I've got is cocoa and Christmas music." Chris chuckled. "Could be worse." They settled on the floor near the counter, a blanket between them, mugs refilled. Holly queued up a playlist, soft carols, jazzy instrumentals, and the sound wrapped around them like warmth. "So," Holly said, her eyes twinkling, "what's your deal, Captain Declutter? Why the minimalist crusade?" Chris laughed. "After the divorce, I realized I'd spent 18 years accumulating stuff I didn't care about. Furniture I hated, clothes I never wore. So I got rid of it all. Sold, trashed, donated. Now it's just what I need." Holly smiled. "That's kind of amazing." Chris shrugged. "It's quiet. Simple. Sounds peaceful," Holly said softly. "It is," Chris said. "Most days." Holly studied him for a moment, her expression gentle. "You seem happy." Chris hesitated, then nodded. "I am. Or at least, I thought I was." Holly tilted her head. "Thought." Chris met her gaze, and for a second, the air shifted, something unspoken humming between them. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The storm raged on, but inside, time felt different, slower, softer. They talked about everything and nothing, favorite movies, worst holiday gifts, the tragedy of fruitcake. Holly teased him about his refusal to wear festive sweaters. Chris mocked her obsession with glitter. They laughed until their cheeks hurt, and every so often, their hands brushed, casual but charged. At one point, Holly pulled out a box of ornaments and showed him her favorites. Tiny villages painted with painstaking detail, snowflakes that looked like lace. Chris listened, fascinated by the way her voice warmed when she talked about her craft, the way her eyes lit like the lights strung above them. "You love this," he said quietly. Holly smiled. "Yeah, silly maybe, but it makes people happy, and that matters." Chris nodded, and something in his chest shifted, like a door opening he hadn't realized was locked. By midnight, the storm had eased, but the roads were still buried. Chris stretched, his muscles stiff from sitting on the floor. "Guess I'm crashing here," he said. Holly laughed. "I've got a couch. Not fancy, but it beats a snowbank." Chris smirked. "I'll take it." She tossed him a pillow and a blanket, and as he settled onto the couch, Holly dimmed the lights, leaving only the soft glow of the tree in the corner. She paused, looking at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Good night, Captain Declutter," she said softly. Chris smiled. "Good night, Holly." When she disappeared into the back room, Chris lay staring at the ceiling, the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, the sound of wind fading outside. He thought about the night, the laughter, the quiet, the way her smile had felt like sunlight in a snowstorm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he hoped. Chapter 8. Emma's Christmas Wish. Chris Thompson woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds and the faint ache of sleeping on Holly's couch. The storm had passed overnight, leaving Maplewood blanketed in pristine snow. A postcard-perfect morning. He stretched, sat up, and glanced around the shop. Holly was already moving about, humming softly as she arranged ornaments on a display. "Morning," Chris said, his voice rough from sleep. Holly looked up, smiling. "Morning, Captain Declutter. Coffee?" Chris grinned. "You're a lifesaver." She handed him a steaming mug, and for a moment, their fingers brushed. Just a flicker, but enough to send a ripple through his chest. He sipped, savoring the warmth, and tried not to think about how easy this felt. How dangerous that was. By noon, the roads were clear enough for Chris to head home. Holly waved from the doorway as he left, her smile bright against the snow. Chris drove slowly, his mind replaying the night, the laughter, the quiet, the way her voice had softened when she asked if he was happy. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. When he walked into his apartment, his phone buzzed. "Emma. Dad. FaceTime me." Chris chuckled and hit the button. Emma's face filled the screen, framed by a halo of messy hair and Christmas lights in the background. "Hey kiddo," Chris said. "What's up?" Emma grinned. "You look tired." "Thanks," Chris said dryly. "I was snowed in at the market." Emma gasped. "With Holly?" Chris sighed. "Yes." Emma squealed so loudly Chris winced. "Dad, that's like fate. A snowstorm? That's rom-com gold." Chris shook his head. "It was just one night." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Did you talk?" Chris hesitated. "Yeah." "Did you laugh?" Chris smirked. "A little." Emma's grin widened. "You like her." Chris opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. "Emma. Dad," Emma said, her voice softening. "I just want you happy." Chris blinked. "I am happy." Emma tilted her head. "Are you? Really?" Chris stared at her, the question settling heavy in his chest. He thought about his quiet apartment, his bourbon nights, his minimalist life. He thought about Holly's laugh, her smile, the way the shop had felt warm and alive. "I don't know," he admitted. Emma smiled gently. "Then maybe find out." Chris swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You're 16. You shouldn't be this wise." Emma grinned. "Someone has to keep you in line." Chris laughed, and for a moment, the heaviness lifted. "Love you, kiddo." "Love you too, Dad," Emma said. "And hey, don't mess this up." Chris shook his head, amused and unsettled all at once. When the call ended, he sat in the quiet, Emma's words echoing like bells. "I just want you happy." That evening, Chris poured himself a bourbon and stared at the ornament Holly had made. Captain Declutter in looping script. He thought about Vicky's confession, about the door he'd closed and the one he wasn't sure he was ready to open. He thought about Holly, her laugh, her warmth, the way she'd looked at him like she saw something worth seeing. His phone buzzed. A text. "Holly, hope you made it home without getting lost in a snowbank. Thanks for last night. You were fun." Chris stared at the screen, a smile tugging at his mouth. He typed back before he could overthink it. "Chris, you weren't so bad yourself. Even with the glitter obsession." 3 dots appeared. Then Holly, "Careful, Captain Declutter. I might convert you yet." Chris laughed, the sound surprising him. He set the phone down, his chest warm in a way that had nothing to do with bourbon. For the first time in years, Christmas didn't feel like something to endure. Felt like something to hope for. Chapter 9. Vicky versus Holly. Maplewood's Christmas market was in full swing again, the square buzzing with shoppers bundled in scarves and mittens, carolers harmonizing under twinkling lights. Holly Bennett stood behind her booth, arranging a new batch of ornaments, tiny snowflakes painted with silver filigree, when she heard the voice. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone polite but edged. Holly looked up and froze. The woman was striking in a sharp, polished way. Sleek black coat, perfectly styled hair, eyes that could slice glass. She didn't need an introduction. Holly knew instinctively. Vicky, Chris's ex-wife. "Hi," Holly said, her smile warm but cautious. "Can I help you?" Vicky's gaze swept over the display, lingering on the personalized ornaments. "You're Holly." Holly blinked. "I am." Vicky's smile was tight. "Emma talks about you." Holly's brows lifted. "She does. Apparently you make custom ornaments," Vicky said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "Captain Declutter, was it?" Holly laughed softly. "That's Chris's nickname, right? Emma told me the story." Vicky's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Chris always did love his little jokes." Holly tilted her head, sensing the undercurrent. "Emma's great. She wanted something special for Christmas." "She's 16, Vicky said, her voice clipped. "She wants a lot of things." Holly smiled, refusing to take the bait. "Well, ornaments are easy wishes to grant." Vicky studied her for a long moment, then leaned in slightly. "You seem close to Chris." Holly blinked, her pulse ticking up. "We've talked. He helped with the fundraiser." "Yes," Vicky said, her tone cool. "I saw that." Holly kept her expression calm, her voice light. "He was amazing. Sold more raffle tickets than anyone." Vicky's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "Chris is dependable. Always has been." Holly nodded. "That's a good quality." "It is," Vicky said softly, her eyes narrowing. One I should have appreciated more. Holly felt the weight of those words, heavy and deliberate. She met Vicky's gaze, steady and unflinching. Chris seems happy, she said gently. Vicky's smile faltered. Does he? Holly didn't answer. She didn't need to. Across the square, Chris was juggling 2 cups of cocoa and a bag of gingerbread cookies when he spotted them. Holly and Vicky, standing at the booth like 2 queens in a silent duel. His stomach dropped. Oh hell. He walked faster, praying no one spilled blood over ornaments. Hey, Chris said, his voice bright, too bright. What's going on? Both women turned to him. Holly smiled, warm, easy. Vicky smiled too, but hers was sharp enough to cut glass. Chris, Vicky said smoothly. I was just meeting. Holly. Chris swallowed. Right? Holly, Vicky. Vicky, Holly. Pleasure, Holly said, her tone calm. Likewise, Vicky said, her tone anything but. Chris handed Holly a cocoa, desperate for normalcy. Thought you might need this. Thanks, Holly said, her fingers brushing his briefly. A flicker that didn't go unnoticed. Vicky's eyes narrowed. Well, she said, her voice cool. I should let you too. Get back to it. Chris nodded quickly. Good idea. Vicky's gaze lingered on him, sharp and searching. See you around, Chris. Yeah, Chris said, his throat tight. When she walked away, the tension eased like a storm breaking. Chris exhaled, turning to Holly. Sorry about that. Holly smiled faintly. No need. Chris rubbed the back of his neck. She's complicated. Holly's eyes softened. So are you. Chris blinked, then laughed. A short, surprised sound. Fair. Holly grinned, and for a moment, the heaviness lifted. The market buzzed around them, lights twinkling, carolers singing, and Chris felt something settle in his chest. Not guilt, not regret, something else, something that felt like choice. Later, as Chris walked Holly to her car, snow crunching under their boots, he thought about the look in Vicky's eyes, the regret, the sharpness, the way her words had clung like frost. He thought about Holly's calm, her warmth, the way she hadn't flinched under pressure. He thought about Emma's voice. I just want you happy. Chris glanced at Holly, her breath misting in the cold, her smile soft as she unlocked her door. Thanks for the cocoa, she said. Thanks for everything, Chris replied, his voice low. Holly tilted her head, her eyes bright. See you soon. Chris swallowed, his pulse ticking up. Yeah, he said. Soon. When she drove away, Chris stood in the snow, the lights of the market glowing behind him, and felt the truth settle like a weight he didn't mind carrying. He wasn't looking back. Not anymore. Chapter 10. The Christmas Eve Revelation. Christmas Eve in Maplewood looked like a dream. Snow blanketing rooftops, lights twinkling on every lamppost, carols drifting from open doors. Chris Thompson stood in his apartment, staring at the tree he'd decorated weeks ago. It looked better now, still minimalist, but softened by the ornaments Emma had added during her last visit. One in particular caught his eye. Captain Declutter, Holly's handiwork, hanging front and center like a quiet dare. Chris poured a bourbon and sat on the couch, his phone buzzing with a text from Emma. Emma. Merry Christmas Eve, Dad. Don't forget tomorrow brunch at Mom's. I'll save you a seat. Chris smiled. Chris, wouldn't miss it. Love you, kiddo. Emma. Love you too. And Dad? Chris raised an eyebrow. Chris. Yeah, Emma. Don't spend tonight alone. Chris stared at the screen, her words settling heavy and warm in his chest. He thought about the past 2 years, the quiet nights, the bourbon, the freedom he'd clung to like armor. He thought about Vicky's confession, about the door he'd closed without hesitation. And he thought about Holly, her laugh, her warmth, the way she'd looked at him under twinkling lights like she saw something worth seeing. He set down the glass, his pulse ticking up. For the first time in years, he didn't want quiet. He didn't want armor. He wanted her. Chris grabbed his coat and keys, ignoring the voice in his head listing all the reasons this was reckless. He wasn't ready. He didn't do relationships. He'd promised himself this was his time, his clean slate, his stress-free life. But promises didn't mean much when your heart had other plans. The streets were alive with Christmas magic. Families laughing, couples strolling hand in hand, the scent of cinnamon and pine drifting through the cold air. Chris drove slowly, his mind racing faster than the car. When he reached the square, the market was closing, vendors packing up under strings of fading lights. Holly's booth was still glowing, a warm pocket of color against the snow. She was there, stacking boxes, her breath misting in the chill. When she looked up and saw him, her smile bloomed like sunlight breaking through clouds. Captain Declutter, she said, her voice bright and surprised. What are you doing here? Chris swallowed hard, his throat tight. I needed to see you. Holly blinked, her expression softening. Everything okay? Chris stepped closer, the snow crunching under his boots. No, he said quietly. And yes, I've been telling myself I'm fine, that I don't need anyone, that I like my life the way it is. Holly watched him, her eyes steady, her breath slow. But then you showed up. Chris said, his voice rough. And suddenly, I'm laughing again. I'm hoping again. And I don't know what that means, but I know I don't want to ignore it. Holly's lips parted, her eyes shining in the glow of the lights. Chris, he took a breath, the cold biting his lungs. I'm not asking for forever. I'm not even asking for next week. I'm just asking if you'd let me try, if you'd let me see where this goes. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The snow, the lights, the hum of distant carols. Then Holly smiled, slow and warm, like the answer had been waiting all along. I'd like that, she said softly. Chris exhaled, something in his chest loosening like a knot undone. He laughed, a short, shaky sound, and Holly laughed too, her breath mingling with his in the cold. Good, Chris said, his voice low, because I have no idea what I'm doing. Perfect, Holly said, her eyes twinkling. Neither do I. The square was nearly empty now, the lights casting a golden glow over the snow. Chris reached for Holly's hand, tentative but sure, and when her fingers curled around his, it felt like the simplest, truest thing in the world. They walked together under the arch of lights, the cold forgotten, the noise fading, until they stopped near the towering tree in the center of the square. Holly looked up, her cheeks pink, her smile soft. Pretty magical, right? She said. Chris studied her, the lights reflecting in her eyes. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. And then, without overthinking, without hesitation, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It was warm and real, and everything Chris hadn't known he was missing. Holly kissed him back, her hands sliding into his coat pockets like they belonged there. And for a moment, the world was just this, snow and lights and the taste of hope. When they broke apart, Holly laughed softly, her forehead resting against his. Merry Christmas, Captain Declutter. Chris smiled, his heart steady for the first time in years. Merry Christmas, Holly. Chapter 11. The kiss under the lights. Maplewood Square was alive with Christmas magic. The towering tree glittered like a jewel, its lights casting golden halos across the snow. Lanterns glowed along the paths, carolers sang in perfect harmony, and the air smelled of cinnamon and pine. It was the kind of night that belonged in a movie, the kind Chris Thompson had spent years avoiding. Until now, he stood with Holly beneath the arch of twinkling lights, her hand warm in his, the echo of their kiss still humming through his veins. Around them, laughter floated like music, couples strolled arm in arm, and children darted past with candy canes clutched like treasure. Chris barely noticed any of it. His world had narrowed to Holly, her smile, her breath misting in the cold, the way her eyes seemed to hold every light in the square. You okay? Holly asked softly, her voice teasing but tender. Chris laughed, a short, shaky sound. Define okay. Holly grinned. You look like someone who just broke a personal rule. Chris smirked. Maybe I did. Was it worth it? She asked, her eyes bright. Chris met her gaze, steady and sure. Yeah, he said quietly. It was. Holly's smile softened, and for a moment, the noise of the square faded, leaving only the hush of falling snow and the thrum of something new between them. The mayor's voice boomed over the speakers, announcing the start of the Christmas Eve countdown. People gathered near the tree, their faces glowing in the light. Holly tugged Chris toward the crowd, her laughter spilling like bells. Come on, she said. You can't skip the best part. Chris groaned, but let her pull him in. They stood shoulder to shoulder as the crowd began to chant. 10-9-8. Chris glanced at Holly, her cheeks pink, her eyes shining like stars. He felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Not just attraction, not just hope, belonging. 3-2-1. The tree blazed to life, thousands of lights bursting like fireworks against the dark sky. The crowd erupted in cheers. Carolers launched into silent night, and Holly turned to him, her smile so bright it made his chest ache. Pretty magical, right? She said. Chris studied her, the glow of the lights painting her face in gold. Yeah, he said softly. It is. And then, without hesitation, without fear, he kissed her again. This time it wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful. It was warm and certain, and everything Chris hadn't known he was missing. Holly kissed him back, her hands sliding into his coat pockets like they belonged there. And for a moment, the world was just this, snow and lights and the taste of something that felt like home. When they broke apart, Holly laughed softly, her forehead resting against his. You're full of surprises, Captain Declutter. Chris smiled, his heart steady for the first time in years. Guess I'm not a lost cause after all. Holly grinned. Not even close. They wandered through the square hand in hand, sipping cocoa, laughing at the carolers' dramatic flourishes, and dodging mistletoe ambushes from overzealous volunteers. Holly teased Chris about his minimalist tree. Chris threatened to stage an intervention for her glitter addiction. It was easy, natural, like they'd been doing this forever. At one point, Holly stopped near a vendor selling gingerbread cookies shaped like reindeer. She bought two, handed one to Chris, and bit into hers with a grin. Best part of Christmas, she declared, crumbs dusting her lips. Chris chuckled, taking a bite. Not bad. Not bad. Holly gasped. Blasphemy. Chris smirked. I'm more of a bourbon guy. Holly laughed, her eyes dancing. Figures. As the night wound down, the square emptied, leaving only the glow of lights and the hush of snow. Chris walked Holly to her car, the cold biting but forgotten in the warmth between them. She paused at the door, her breath misting in the air, her smile soft. Thanks for tonight, she said. Chris shook his head. No, thank you. Holly tilted her head, her eyes searching his. So what now? Chris swallowed, his pulse ticking up. Now we see where this goes. Holly smiled, a slow, certain smile that felt like a promise. I'd like that. Chris grinned, his chest light, his heart steady. Me too. When she drove away, Chris stood in the snow, the lights of the square glowing behind him, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace and possibility. Chapter 12. A new tradition. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight glinting off snow like diamonds scattered across Maplewood. Chris Thompson stood in his kitchen, the scent of cinnamon rolls drifting from the oven, a pot of coffee brewing on the counter. His apartment felt different today, warmer, fuller, alive in a way it hadn't in years. Because Holly was here. She sat at the table in a soft red sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, laughing as she tried to untangle a ribbon Emma had tied around a gift box like a security system. Emma, perched on a stool, grinned like a cat who'd swallowed the canary. Dad, Emma said, eyes sparkling. You didn't tell me Holly was coming. Chris smirked, pouring coffee into mugs. Surprise. Emma squealed, clapping her hands. Best Christmas ever. Holly laughed, her cheeks pink. I hope I live up to the hype. You already do, Emma said, handing her the box. Open it. Holly peeled back the paper, revealing a small ornament, a snowflake painted with silver and gold, the words Maplewood magic looping across the center. Her eyes softened. Emma, Holly said, her voice warm. This is beautiful. Emma grinned. Figured you needed one for your tree. Holly smiled, and Chris felt something in his chest loosen, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. This was what he'd been missing. Not just laughter, not just warmth, connection. They spent the morning in a blur of cocoa and cinnamon rolls, trading gifts and teasing each other about wrapping skills. Emma gave Chris a tie covered in tiny snowflakes. Festive dad. You're welcome. And Holly nearly choked laughing when he held it up like a trophy. Guess I'm officially converted, Chris said, draping it around his neck. Next year, ugly sweater, Holly teased. Don't push your luck, Chris shot back, grinning. Later, they bundled up and walked to the square, the snow crunching under their boots, the lights still twinkling from the night before. The market was quiet now, vendors packing up, but the tree stood tall and proud, its glow soft against the winter sky. Emma darted ahead, snapping photos with her phone. Chris and Holly followed at a slower pace, their hands brushing, then linking like it was the most natural thing in the world. Thank you, Chris said quietly. Holly glanced at him, her eyes bright. For what? For this? Chris said, gesturing to the square, the snow, the laughter still echoing in his head. For making Christmas feel like Christmas again. Holly smiled, her breath misting in the cold. You did that yourself. Chris shook his head. Not alone. Holly squeezed his hand, and for a moment, the world felt still, just snow and lights and the hum of something new. That evening, after Emma left for dinner with Vicky, Chris and Holly sat on the couch, the tree glowing softly in the corner. Holly curled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and Chris felt a peace he hadn't known in years. This is nice, Holly murmured. Chris smiled, his fingers brushing hers. Yeah, it is. Holly tilted her head, her eyes meeting his. Think it could be more than nice. Chris swallowed, his chest tight, but not with fear, with certainty. I do. Holly smiled, a slow, sure smile that felt like a promise. Me too. Chris kissed her then, soft and lingering, and when they broke apart, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a moment. It was a beginning. Chapter 13. Epilogue. Next Christmas, Maplewood Square glittered under a fresh layer of snow, the towering tree glowing like a beacon against the winter sky. The market bustled with holiday cheer, vendors selling cocoa, carolers harmonizing under lanterns, laughter spilling into the crisp air. It was Christmas Eve again, but for Chris Thompson, everything felt different. Because this year, he wasn't alone. Chris stood in his apartment, adjusting a string of lights on the tree. A real tree this time, full and fragrant, decked out in ornaments that told a story. Captain Declutter hung, front and center, a quiet nod to where it all began. Beside it, a snowflake painted with Maplewood magic, and a dozen others Holly had crafted over the past year. The tree wasn't minimalist anymore. It was alive, vibrant, a reflection of something Chris had learned the hard way. Happiness wasn't about less. It was about more of the right things. The doorbell rang, and Chris grinned, wiping his hands on a towel. Holly breezed in, her cheeks pink from the cold, her arms full of gifts wrapped in paper so glittery Chris pretended to shield his eyes. Seriously? He teased. You're trying to blind me. Holly laughed, setting the gifts under the tree. It's festive. It's a hazard, Chris said, pulling her into a hug. She smelled like cinnamon and snow, and when she kissed him, the world tilted in the best way. Guests will be here soon, Holly said, slipping off her coat. Emma texted. She's bringing cookies. Chris smiled. She's been planning this for weeks. I love that kid, Holly said warmly. She's got your stubborn streak. Chris chuckled. Don't tell her that. By 6, the apartment buzzed with laughter and music. Emma arrived first, arms full of cookies and sass. Dad, she said, hugging him tight. This place looks amazing. Chris grinned. Thanks, kiddo. Emma turned to Holly, her smile wide. You're wearing glitter again. Always, Holly said, winking. Emma laughed, and Chris felt his chest swell with something deep and steady. This, his daughter happy, Holly laughing, the apartment alive with warmth, was everything he hadn't known he needed. Later, Vicky arrived. Chris had wondered how this would feel. Awkward, tense, maybe even painful. But when she stepped inside, her smile was calm, her eyes soft. She hugged Emma, greeted Holly politely, and handed Chris a bottle of wine with a quiet, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Chris said, his voice even. They talked briefly, safe topics, light and easy. Vicky seemed different, not bitter, not sharp, just resigned, maybe even at peace. When she glanced at Holly, there was no hostility, only a flicker of something wistful. Then she turned back to Emma, laughing at a joke, and Chris felt a quiet relief settle in his chest. The past was the past, and tonight was about the present. The evening unfolded in a blur of cocoa and carols, laughter and stories. Emma played DJ, Holly staged a gingerbread contest, and Chris found himself laughing so hard his cheeks hurt. At one point, Holly slipped her hand into his under the table, her fingers warm and sure, and Chris thought, this is what home feels like. When the guests left and the apartment fell quiet, Chris and Holly stood by the tree, the lights casting a golden glow over the room. Holly leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and Chris felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Next year, Holly murmured, ugly sweater party. Chris groaned. You're relentless. Holly grinned. You love it. Chris laughed softly, kissing her temple. Yeah, he said. I do. As midnight approached, Chris stepped onto the balcony, the cold biting his skin, the town glowing below like a constellation. Holly joined him, her breath misting in the air, her smile soft. Hard to believe it's been a year, she said. Chris nodded, his chest full. Hard to believe how much can change. Holly slipped her arm through his, and they stood together, watching snow fall like quiet blessings. Chris thought about the man he'd been last Christmas, alone, armored, convinced happiness meant solitude. He thought about the storm, the laughter, the kiss under the lights. He thought about Emma's words, I just want you happy. And he realized something simple and true. He was